Okay, it's 10, so I think we'll get started.
Sounds good.
Okay. Good morning and welcome to the North Fork Foodie Tour webinar, Alternative Packaging and its Impact on Wine. My name is Ellen Zimmerman, and I'll be your host for the webinar, which will be led by Shelby Hearn, Director of Sales and Marketing for Suhru Wines in Cutchogue. Growing up as a winemaker's daughter, Shelby took an interest in the wine industry at a young age. Her first memories include running through the vineyard, conducting experiments in the lab with her sister, and helping her dad during harvest. Since 2005, Shelby has worked in tasting rooms, planted vineyards, hand-harvested grapes, bottled, worked in the cellar, and has sampled her fair share along the way. Shelby has toured the wine regions of Austria and Hungary, as well as many in the US. Before moving to the North Fork and joining Suhru Wines full-time, Shelby lived in Brooklyn, where she was a marketing professional at Penguin Random House, and later ran marketing efforts at Brooklyn Winery. Shelby will be happy to answer your questions. Click on the Q&A button on your Zoom screen to type in your questions. Shelby, do you want to get the questions during the course of your talk, or do you want people to hold their questions to the end?
You're more than welcome to ask questions throughout. So we can do a little bit of mix of both as they come up. Everyone feel free to type them in, and then if there's more at the end, that works as well.
Okay, so without further ado, tell us about packaging.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I'm really excited to talk about alternative packaging today. And we're going to talk primarily about screw caps and cans. But before we get into all of that, I wanted to give a little bit of history on bottles and corks, because I think it gives a nice context for the comparison and how the technology has evolved over time. So jumping right in, looking at traditional closures, as we all know, people have been making wine for millenniums, with the first wine dating back to sometime between 8,000 and 4,000 BC. So we've been making wine for quite a long time. And one of the primary challenges since the beginning with wine has always been how to store it and how to package it to ensure that you do get a quality product with good life to it. So originally, glass bottles were not used for wine storage. They really started coming onto the market and being seen in a larger scale in the 17th century. But that was still primarily a rarity. So you saw them, but they were more of a luxury item to have wine in glass bottles. Glass bottles were not standardized in the same way that they are today. So there were quite a wide variety of bottle sizes and shapes, which made it quite difficult for packaging. There was actually a lot of strong opposition to using glass at the time, and in some places it's actually illegal to sell wine in bottles because there was so much variation in size that there was strong belief that producers and sellers were cheating customers out of the volume because there was so much volume variation. So it wasn't till the 1820s that the bottle sizes and shapes that we use today really started coming in on the market. However, it was still in the 17th century that you started to see bottles start to be used on a more of a mass scale. So up until in the 1615, King James I decided that forests were going to be primarily used for warship building. And prior to that, a lot of that wood had been used in furnaces for specifically glass blowing. So it was around that time when there really was a wood shortage that people had to start getting creative and started playing with how they were making glass. And so a lot of the manufacturers started switching to coal, which burned a lot longer and a lot hotter, which really made much stronger glass and allowed that glass to be turned into more widespread production. So once they were able to burn the fires hotter and longer, they were able to make much stronger glass, much better suited for mass production and for wine storage, which was great. So it was actually kind of a fun fact about that time. It was Sir Digby, who was a pirate at the time, who actually was the one to invent this new process for blowing glass and blowing these stronger, more sustainable and more mass production glass bottles. So it was actually in the process of, he was working on a scheme essentially to stretch gold and add a number of different byproducts into the gold that allowed him to discover this new way to create stronger, thicker, and darker glass, which was really great because that allowed a lot of the light pollution that you see in glass to be eliminated. So it was around that time that you started seeing glass come onto a much bigger availability, but it wasn't till actually the 1900s that you really saw mass production begin. So then on that note, with once you have glass, obviously the other main component historically has always been cork. With wine, cork is always the largest variable. Cork's been used in wine packaging since 3000 BC, so it's been used for quite a long time, both for closure purposes as well as in shoes and a number of other products. So the way that cork is harvested is actually very interesting. Cork is a natural product. With that comes a lot of both positives and negatives. So cork is made by harvesting the bark of a specific type of oak tree. And that type of oak tree, once it reaches 25 years of maturity, it can be harvested into what we use as cork. And that is done by essentially stripping the bark off of these trees by hand with an axe. It's a very labor-intensive process. And then that bark is then washed in a very specific way and then produced into cork, which all of that is wonderful. However, historically, what we have seen is that cork, being a natural and organic product, does have some negatives associated with it. Obviously, cork allows for that wonderful oxygen exchange in the bottle, which is what we're all looking for with our packaging, to allow those bottles to have that nice oxygen exchange with red. So you get those nice bottle aging characteristics, which is what we're looking for. However, as you may have heard in the past, with a wine under cork, you do have the possibility of having a corked bottle, which essentially means that you have spoilage in the wine, which is coming from TCA, which is, I always butcher the pronunciation of this chemical, but it's trichlorosil, I believe is the correct pronunciation, which is a chemical that can be introduced into the wine through the cork itself. So TCA is essentially created when chlorine, which is used in the cleaning of that bark when it's processed into cork, when chlorine comes in contact with a mold that forms naturally on the bark. So when that happens, essentially what you can get is, and that mold can occur naturally on the bark, but it also can be introduced through some of the spray residue and pesticides that are sprayed generally on these trees. So when that chemical reaction happens, it can release essentially a wet cardboard or wet dog taste and aroma into the wine. So if you've ever had a corked corked being spoiled, not corked as in a bottle of wine under a cork closure. So if you've ever had a corked bottle of wine or a spoiled bottle of wine, generally it's a very strong taste, and you know it pretty quickly. That's classically why in restaurants, or particularly at higher end restaurants, if you have a bottle that you're being served tableside, they'll taste it often in front of you or sometimes behind the bar before they pour it. They're checking to make sure that your bottle of wine isn't spoiled or corked. So across the industry, it's widely accepted that somewhere between 5 to 10% of all bottles of wine that are under traditional cork closures will have some level of TCA in them. So it is a pretty high percentage of spoilage that you can see under a cork closure, which is why in a lot of cases there has been a lot of work done to create alternative forms of cork, as well as to look into alternative packaging. So I'm going to get into that just a little bit later, but one other thing that you can really see, and you do often see from a traditional cork closure, is what's referred to as sporadic oxidation. So because corks are a natural product, you do have the pores of the cork essentially are varying in size depending on the individual tree, where it's harvested off the bark, a number of different variations that can happen with any naturally occurring product. So because there is inconsistency from cork to cork in the size of those pores, and therefore the size of the holes in the cork, you can have higher levels or lower levels of oxidation in the same wine. So you have more variation in that closure, which, as you likely know, with wine, one of the benefits of a cork is that you do have that gradual oxygen exchange coming through the cork, which allows the wines to age. So it can be also very problematic when you have strong inconsistency from bottle to bottle in the same vintage. So now that we've gone over a little bit of the background, because I always think it's really helpful to know where we started to see where we're coming to. Moving into screw caps. So screw caps have, while we all think of them as a relatively new form of technology, they've actually been around for longer than most people think. So in 1889, the first patent for a screw cap was actually established, and that was developed by a man named Dan Reynolds in the UK. However, it would be another 70 years before screw caps would be used in wine packaging. So in 1889, screw caps were started to use for other forms of packaging, but were not used for wine until 1959. So the main benefits from a technology standpoint of screw cap is if you look inside a screw cap, and I've got a couple here that I'm going to show you at different points, but essentially the screw cap is lined with a coating on the entire interior of the cap itself, which is called a PVDV liner. It's polyvinyl chloride, which essentially is a wine proofing and waterproofing layer. So this is what keeps the liquid inside the bottle and creates a really nice tight seal. So this particular type of packaging, all wine screw caps are going to have this PVDV lining, and then that's going to be coupled with either a tin or a Saranax insert, depending on the winemaker's preferences. So I'm going to hold these up to the screen so you can see, just dropped one. But if you look at these two screw caps, I've got just the top half of the screw cap here, just so you can see. If you notice, this one is metallic and shiny. This has a tin lining, whereas this one that I'm moving right now has what's called the Saranax lining. So there are two different inserts that you can essentially have put into your screw cap, because all screw caps are going to be ordered specifically for the wine that you're making. Tin lining, which was the first one that I showed you, the silver insert, is going to be 10% more expensive. But what's really nice about that is it does create a complete seal on the bottle. So with white wines and rosés, what you're really looking for is that really nice bright freshness. White wines and rosés are usually designed to last, to be drunk a little bit quicker than red wines traditionally. So you really want to make sure that you're retaining all of that bright freshness and crisp acidity on those whites and rosés. The tin lining is going to ensure that you have no oxygen exchange, which actually does preserve the wine really nicely. So with a white or rosé, oftentimes under a traditional cork closure, you do get that oxygen exchange, which is not really a benefit to those styles. So this creates a full seal, which is really wonderful, like I said, because it does have that really bright finish. We do have, it looks like we have a question in the Q&A, which I'm just going to answer quickly. We have a question asking how long wine is going to be good for. I'm not sure if this question is referring to the difference between screw caps and corks or just in general, but it's a nice way for me to jump in. Screw caps and corks are essentially going to act the same as far as preservation goes. If anything, particularly talking about these tin lining screw caps, you're going to get more life and longer freshness out of your whites and your rosés. So it actually can extend the life of a wine a little bit longer. But both under screw cap and under cork, you're going to see about the same amount of time. Really depends on the individual wine, how long you'll want to wait on it before you open. Traditionally, rosés are designed to be, for the most part, are designed to be drunk within a year of its release date, sometimes longer, depending on the style. Whites, again, generally depending on the style, are usually designed to be drunk in under 5 years. And then reds can, depending, once again, on the style, can cellar for quite a bit of time. So a lot of times with reds, particularly on Long Island, the reds that you see here often can cellar for 10, 20 plus years. So I do look like we have one other question. I'm going to hold off on answering that one just for a second because I'm going to get something regarding that a little bit later. So I'm going to come back to your question. Don't worry. But jumping back into the linings for a second. So we talked about the tin lining for whites and rosés. We also have this Saranax lining, which is the white insert that you generally will see if you open up a bottle of red wine. One thing that I should mention as well, if you're looking at screw cap bottles at home, is a tin lining is not always metallic. They are starting to make them in the white, same as you see with the Saranax linings. So you can often open a bottle of white or rosé wine and see this white insert on the inside. That does not mean that you have the wrong insert in your screw cap. They do actually look a little bit different, but to describe the differences, they're very small, minute differences. If you're not looking at them very closely, it's hard to tell. But essentially, there's not necessarily, I just want to make it clear to everyone, a white insert in a white or rosé is not necessarily, can still be a tin lining. It doesn't mean that it's the Saranax lining. These two just happen to be very nice because it makes it easy to show. However, so the tin linings are going to always be about 10% more expensive than the Saranax lining. The Saranax lining does allow for that really nice oxygen exchange and a very consistent oxygen exchange. So one of the benefits of screw caps over the traditional cork closure is that because it is a manufactured piece of technology, it will always be consistent. there are very few things that can happen that would alter the packaging of a screw cap wine. I mean, there are a couple of things that, if the threading of the screw cap is put on incorrectly, you can have a damaged seal, but that can happen with anything. But that's really the only way that you can have inconsistency from bottle to bottle with screw caps. So the Saranax linings have that really nice gradual oxygen exchange, which has actually been seen. There have been a number of trials and examples of people who have bottled the exact same wine under screw cap and cork and compared them to 5, 10, 15 years down the line, tasting them side by side. And in most, if not all studies, I know a couple at winemakers out here on the North Fork have done that test as well. They've actually seen that under the screw cap, the red wines hold up a lot better because they do have that nice, consistent, gradual oxygen exchange. So it's a really nice plus on that side of the spectrum as well. But going just a little bit into screw caps, as far as the history goes, so screw caps did really start coming onto the market for wine in 1959. There was a French company that started using screw caps on their wine. And then in 1960, a Bordeaux winery also did a larger test, doing quite a number of their vintages under screw cap. However, at the time, the market and the consumers really did not really appreciate that particular type of closure. It did not go over very well. And they also, in the 1960 Bordeaux trial, they used a paper wad backing instead of the Saranax backing in the screw caps, which is not nearly as effective. So that experiment was essentially shelved, and they came back to it about 10 years later. The Swiss started in 1970, really started to fully embrace screw caps, both with the tin and Saranax linings. And that was the point when screw caps really started in a much bigger way to come onto the market. In the 1980s, that was the predominant closure and continues to be the predominant closure in all Swiss wine. And then in the 1970s, Australia really jumped on the ball as well. So they had been doing a number of trials, going back to what I was saying before, with producers bottling wine under cork and screw cap to compare the difference. There was a number of wineries in Australia that really embraced that and really tried to give that a nice go. They saw at the time a good amount, again, of consumer resistance. So they continued using screw caps, but it wasn't seen on a wide scale until the early 2000s, when the industry really put a lot of effort into education around screw caps. And at that point, screw caps were really embraced by the public and have been rapidly growing across the globe as far as a closure goes ever since, which has been really wonderful for a lot of reasons, because screw caps have historically had a perception, and this goes back to a couple of those experiments that I was just mentioning, where the consumer and the market was not ready for screw caps. It's really been, over the last couple of decades, it's been a really strong effort by producers to educate the public and explain the differences between the two, because screw caps do have the perception of being a cheaper closure, and they're really not. I'm going to, in a minute, we'll go through all the pricing of it so you can get a sense, but they're really not a cheaper packaging, and they actually can be if you, depending on the packaging you choose, they can be a more expensive packaging. So it's a very interesting comparison to look at. I think the market and the consumer base has really turned the corner in a big way. At Suhru, all of our wines are under screw cap. We started making our wines in 2008, and we other than the one sparkling wine that we make, everything is under screw cap. And then the minute they figure out how to make a screw cap for a sparkling wine, we will be under screw cap for that one as well. Because it's been really interesting, even with our one wine that is our sparkling under cork, we do see, you know, that 5 to 10% of spoilage. We do see that natural element and that TCA coming into effect, whereas with all of our screw cap wines, we have no issue at all. I feel very comfortable opening a bottle of wine and pouring it without having to taste it. I know that every bottle is going to be perfectly consistent under our screw caps, which is really wonderful. So looking at screw caps versus corks, there are quite a number of benefits. I've talked about a number of them so far, but just to go in a little bit further, screw caps offer a very reliable seal, which is wonderful. You know that you're going to get consistency from bottle to bottle. It is an inert closure, so essentially it does not add any flavor to the wine, whereas corks can introduce both a negative flavor in TCA, in that corked spoilage, or a positive flavor with oxygen exchange. However, if you're using the Saranax closure in a screw capped bottle of wine, you also can get that oxygen exchange. So if you look at the net positive and negatives, really the only difference is that with screw caps, you eliminate the possibility of spoilage, which is really great. They also offer a little bit more affordability depending on the packaging that you choose. There are options when it comes to screw caps, and I'll show you the difference in a minute. But if you look at, you know, pricing, with cork, you have a number of different options. You can do a fully natural cork, which is, as we talked about before, you harvest the bark, you process the bark, you make it into cork. And those, depending on the quality of the choice, are going to cost anywhere from 25 to 45 cents a cork. There's also an option for a composite cork or a DM cork, which is essentially cork particles. So with that cork, it's going to be about 30 cents a cork, and it is a more labor-intensive process. So essentially what happens with that is TCA lives in the moisture in the tree bark. So you'll get to avoid that process. Essentially, with a composite cork, they're going to take the bark and dehydrate it, eliminating all of the water and removing all the liquid, which will essentially remove any possibility of TCA in the final product, which is great. It's a more labor intensive process. However, it's not an entirely natural cork. So they dehydrate the bark, remove all of the possibility of mold, and then compress and stick the cork back together. So you have it's a slightly different product. You also have the possibility of synthetic cork, which is plastic cork, which those will be about 10 cents a cork as well. So there's quite a bit of range as far as pricing goes. And then, and this is all talking about standard pricing, so not talking about customizing your corks. And then on top of that, most times if you have a cork, you're going to add a capsule. And those for the standard polylaminate capsules are going to be about 15 cents a piece. If you're using the shrink wrap or the plastic capsules, those are going to be quite a bit cheaper. Those are 2-3 cents a piece. So to give you a point of reference. Versus a screw cap, there are two different types that you can buy. So the tin and the two linings are offered under both options, but essentially, if you look at my two bottles here, I have two different screw caps. I have a Stelvin screw cap and a Lux. The main difference is if you look at my rosé bottle, my Stelvin, you can see all of the threads on the top. So if you look right here, you can see where all the threads are, versus my Lux. So if you see, this Lux is completely flush. So it really is an aesthetic choice. However, there's quite a big price difference. So a Stelvin is going to be about 18 cents a piece, whereas a Lux is 50 cents a piece, which brings, if you look at the difference there, if you're using a natural cork at 45 cents, the higher end of the price point, plus you're using a traditional polylaminate capsule at 15 cents, we're looking at, sorry, early in the morning and I'm a little bit sleepy, at about 60 cents for a cork and capsule versus the higher end screw cap option, which is going to be 50 cents. So you can obviously have the cheaper option on the other end of the spectrum if you're using the lower price point end of a natural cork, more like 25 cents plus the traditional capsule. So that's going to be about 40 cents. That's going to be less than the Lux. The main difference there, though, is depending on the volume that you're creating. You have to remember, under a cork, you're going to have anywhere from 5 to 10% of spoilage. And those bottles, if a restaurant has a corked bottle, wineries will take that back. If a consumer experiences a corked bottle, wineries will take those back as well. So that's just a loss that we're committing to. Or there also is a good chance that people don't always know what a corked bottle of wine is, and you have a spoiled wine, don't realize that it's spoiled, and I just think that the wine's not very good, and then you choose not to go back and to buy that producer's wine again. We do have on that note, we do have a question about corking and what it tastes or smells like. So a corked bottle of wine, if you ever had one, usually most people do pick up on it quite quickly. It is essentially, it's a wet cardboard, like a wet dog aroma. And taste. So if you stick your nose in the glass, it's going to taste or it's going to smell very, very similar to wet cardboard. Some people think that it smells a little bit more like wet dog. To me, it smells like wet cardboard. And then it's going to have, I think of the best way to describe the taste. It is, if you're familiar with the wine, it's going to taste incredibly different from what the wine should taste like, but essentially it's going to taste a little bit funky, a little bit flat, a little bit cardboardy, and I know it's a strange way to describe it, but it's going to taste wet and almost like damp. If you just come in from the rain and the way that people smell when your clothes are damp after you've been out in the rain, it's going to taste kind of like that smell, if that makes sense. But it has a very distinct kind of funk to it, and I very strongly recommend, if you're ever at a restaurant and you have a glass of wine or a bottle of wine that you think tastes incorrectly, send it back or ask the person behind the bar, ask your waiter, waitress, bartender to taste the wine and say that you don't think that that tastes quite right, because you're always welcome to do that in a restaurant or at a winery. And we do generally, most people really appreciate when you point out there's a spoiled wine, because the worst thing on our end is for someone to have a bad wine experience and for them to not know what's wrong with it and not tell us and let us correct it. So I definitely always recommend speaking up and being vocal about that. The other couple of quick things on screw caps before I talk about cans are the other nice thing is that a screw cap does hold the internal pressure much more than a cork. So you can sustain higher temperature swings without any problem. So if you look at, often in the summer months, people get very concerned about shipping wine because if the wine does hit above that 80, 85 degrees, the cork, the wine will heat up and the pressure will start pushing the cork out of the bottle, which will allow more oxygen into the bottle, essentially increasing the rate of oxidation and more quickly spoiling the wine. Whereas under a screw caps can handle a little bit more pressure, so you can handle much higher temperature swings without that really being a concern. So it's one of the nice things when we're shipping wine over the summer months or in the warmer months. we don't have to worry about it quite as much. You know, if temperatures are going to be consistently in the 90s or above, we may hold off on shipping to certain places until those temperatures drop. But with a screw cap bottle of wine, it's really not something that we have to be nearly as concerned about as with the traditional cork. One of the other really nice things is a screw cap bottle of wine. We don't need a corkscrew, and you can very easily close it back up, put it in the fridge, put it away, and come back to it later, which is really nice. So moving on to cans, and I know, I don't know, I can't remember how long this webinar is supposed to be, so if I'm going over, I do apologize.
You've got till 1:45.
Oh, I've got a bit more time. Okay, perfect.
Okay.
So perfect. Cans are a newer technology. At Suhru, we made 2 different cans this year. We put our rosé and our Pinot Grigio in cans. And what's really nice about the cans is they're, you know, over the last couple of years, technology has really been changing for wine. There's been a number of new packaging options that have come on the market. You have screw caps, of course, and cans, as well as you're seeing much more box wine, as well as kegs, and a number of other single serving wine products as well. So there's a nice bit of variation that's been coming on the market. Cans, there's been a lot of technological advances, which has been wonderful. And the other really nice thing about cans is that they're recyclable, which is amazing, and much easier recycled than glass. So if you look at cans, cans are actually the largest and fastest growing segment of the wine industry at the moment, and have been for the last several years. They're really very rapidly expanding branding option. So cans, essentially the way that the technology works is if you were to put wine in Coca-Cola can, for example, the wine has too high of a pH, so too high of an acidity, and would eat the can from the inside out. So the cans that we're using for wine are specifically designed for wine and are very different from the cans that you're using for soda, Coca-Cola, and all of those products. So the Ball company, who does the glass jars, they produced and patented a proprietary non-BPA liner for cans several years ago. Cans initially were using a BPA liner, but are no longer, and have not been for several years now. And they use what's called the Infinity system as a quality control check. So all cans that are made for wine go through this 105 criteria inspection test to make sure that they are perfectly manufactured for wine. And all wine cans are individually tested before the final product is made. So when we make a wine, we have to send our finished wine to our can producer, who then tests our specific wine in the specific packaging that we have decided upon to ensure that the pH balance is going to be correct and that our wine is not too acidic for the packaging, because there are some wines that are too acidic for the packaging and cannot go into cans. So these are all the cans that are used for wine are aluminum, which is really wonderful because it is the fastest recyclable packaging product, and requires 95% less energy to recycle aluminum than to create new. So it is a very green, sustainable option. It's also a lot lighter. Most of the cost that's associated with wine is involved in shipping the glass, both empty and full, which obviously uses quite a bit of energy and gas. So these are much lighter products, which are really nice. So it also does offer a tighter seal than either a screw cap or a bottle, a cork closure. So it keeps a really nice, bright freshness and acidity, which is why you do see more cans being used for whites and rosés than you do for reds. It's also very convenient because you can take them to beach, concerts, golf courses, anywhere that you can't bring glass, and it's also very convenient because they fit nicely in the refrigerator, which for me at least is a very strong plus. But the really nice thing about it is the way that the cans are designed, you do not taste the aluminum at all. So it does give you a very similar, if not particularly with whites and rosés, possibly elevated experience. We do have another question asking, do you feel that cans take away from the branding and allure of a wine? I understand. I understand that question, and it is a question that we get a lot. I think there still is a little bit of stigma and perception around it. So we introduced cans here to our brand and to our tasting room this season for the first time. They have done incredibly well, and we've been really very pleased with how they're going throughout the season, even with the challenges of this particular season. But we do still have people coming in saying, you know, I don't know how I feel about this, and which I totally understand. Not everyone feels comfortable drinking wine out of a can, in the same way that I know plenty of people who prefer not to drink their beer out of the can either. They're going to buy a can or a bottle of beer and pour it into a glass. And what I always say is there's absolutely no reason why you can't do the same with wine. With canned wines, once they're chilled, and even when they're not chilled, you really do not taste the aluminum at all as you're taking a sip. But there are plenty of times when I'm not necessarily on the go. I mean, they're great on the beach if I don't want to have to worry about glasses or bringing anything extra with me, or on the boat. But there are definitely plenty times and instances when I've been home and you don't necessarily want to open a whole bottle of wine, or the people I'm with, we all want to drink something different, and it's a really nice opportunity to be able to open a can. And our cans, the standard can size, are 375 5 milliliters, which is the equivalent of half a bottle. So it actually is a good amount of wine in one can. And the nice thing is, actually, when you compare the two sizes, you can see per volume how much less packaging you're using with cans than you are with glass. And just for comparison, it's significantly less, and translates into significantly less with shipping and transportation as you're moving them around the country, before bottling and before packaging, as well as distribution and then sending them out. So it does save in a lot of different ways. But going back to what I always do say is that, there's no reason why you can't take the can, pour it into a glass, and drink it at home. That way you don't have to worry about, if you don't want to have the same wine as somebody else that night, you don't want to have to worry about, feeling the pressure to finish the bottle. It's a nice alternative for that. And like I said before, with cans with whites and rosés, you do get much brighter, crisper wines for longer, which is really nice. Rosés in particular, you do start this time of year, rosés do start to fade in their flavor. And generally by January, you can notice a marked difference in the freshness and the brightness of the acidity of a rosé that was bottled the previous year. So, for example, 19 rosés, for the most part, are really designed to be consumed within the 2020 calendar. However, with the can, because it has no oxygen exchange at all, and is a complete seal with absolutely no light exposure either, which can also increase the degradation of a wine, you wind up maintaining that brightness for a lot longer, which is really great. Okay, let's see. We do also have a question on are cans for wine similar to cans for beer? They're going to be more similar than cans for soda, but they are different. Wine generally has a higher pH, a higher acidity than beer, so it is similar. And the technology is very similar. However, it is still going to be a little bit different. The lining that is designed for wine cans is specific for wine. It's going to be a different liner that they're using in cans for beer. So there is some variation there, but it's more similar than not. How, with the main difference being that wine cans are designed to hold a liquid with a higher pH.
So Shelby, I think we've run out of time.
Yes, I think we did. I'm sorry for talking so much.
That's okay. It's been very interesting.
Yeah.
I learned a lot from this lecture. I'm sure everybody else did.
Good.
Thank you so much for being with us. And I want to just talk to our audience for a minute. As you know, there's no charge for logging into the Foodie Tour webinars. We hope you enjoy them. And if you did, we hope you'll consider making a donation at northforkfoodietour.com. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.